What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 33, The Great War and the World in Upheaval. First up is our overview. The Great War of 1914 to 1919 was a nearly global conflagration that included all the major powers of Europe, their colonies, and overseas allies. The immediate provocation was a relatively minor incident, the assassination to the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the causes were long-standing and much more complex. Pressure to seek war and resist compromise had been mounting in the late 19th and early 20th century. Fed by aggressive nationalism, ambitious militarism, and complex national alliances, the war, when it came, was not what anyone had expected. The new kind of warfare. New technologies transformed the experience of war. Offensive battle plans stalled in the trenches, where soldiers were pounded by heavy artillery, trapped by machine gun fire, and vulnerable to poisonous gas. Casualties were counted in the hundreds of thousands, and progress was measured in yards gained. Total war. World War I engaged civilian populations to an unprecedented degree. On the home front, women took up the work abandoned by recruits. Governments took control of wartime production, and propaganda campaigns demonized the enemy and glorified the war effort. Civilians were also targets of the war through aerial bombing and naval blockades. The Russian Revolution. The revolution was triggered by the war, but sprang from long-standing failure of the Tsarist government to meet the needs of the Russian people. For a while, it seemed that a liberal democracy might emerge, but within the months the Bolshevik Party under the direction of Lenin overthrew the provisional government. Peace and unresolved questions. Armistice came in 1918, shortly after the United States entered the war. At the Paris Peace Conference, the victors, especially Britain and France, dictated harsh terms to the defeated Central Powers, dismantled their colonial empires, and imposed economic penalties. The bitterness engendered by the peace settlement virtually ensured that another conflict would follow. All right, so first we have these big ideas. World War I really is this chapter. What it's about, what we're kind of focusing on is this is the culmination of advanced technology as a result of industrialization and its processes that led to like a very large-scale war that had seen very large numbers of people die in a very relatively small amount of time. It wasn't necessarily the most casualties or the most violent war in human history, but for sure it was seen as very catastrophic to the central section of Europe that we normally traditionally call like Europe as we've been studying it. It was also a war of resources. Really, these cultures and these countries were really looking towards having more resources as a result of having this war, but it really stemmed from kind of an undercurrent that had been building as a result of imperialism that many European countries were facing around the world. It was spurred on by nationalism, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the idea of individual countries feeling that their specific nation was better in many ways than others, and this led to the need by those countries to violently act out that power struggle. We'd see empires collapse and reset. We see a lot of Europe kind of see a great dramatic change in terms of who's in charge, where they're in charge, the regions they're in charge of. And we also see a reset of certain countries and nationalities becoming their own countries or states on the world stage. We have a setup and foreshadowing of the 20th century. Really, World War I kind of sets up some of the conflicts we're going to see for the rest of our book. As the 20th century begins, we have this great war that really culminates in having kind of a bitterness all around Europe, especially in Germany, and directly leads to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in World War II. For our sections, we're going to talk about the start and causes, the reasons for the conflict, issues and the resolution that they kind of face to the end, and then the start of larger diplomatic relations around the world. We see at this point in world history, it's no longer acceptable to be in your own little sphere of influence or your own little region of the world. You now need to become a player on the global stage to be taken seriously or to be a part of the global community that is starting to form around the world. In a number of ways, people are starting to see the world as smaller than it once was, even during the time that we've been talking about in previous chapters with trade and how people were able to connect through trade. Really, World War I sets up this whole structure where people have to start to work together really to try and make the world work, essentially. So, the immediate origins of World War I. On June 28, 1914, there's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, pictured here, in the city of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, what had happened was Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1878, and it's annexed into part of its empire by 1908. Now, by all accounts, Franz Ferdinand was very much a progressive in the fact that he saw that empire wasn't really, not that he didn't see it as necessary, but he didn't see it as very beneficial, as many of the people of his time started to notice that there was rising nationalism within certain regions of empires, as we've talked about in previous chapters, where people were starting to demand independence from larger empires, especially the sections within Austria-Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ferdinand was in favor of a greater Serbian autonomy. This is Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, like Serbia. This area of the globe, these people really were demanding a change to the political order, and some of them were not willing to wait for that political order to establish itself on the whims of individual rulers or leaders. So even though Archduke Franz Ferdinand was very progressive in his beliefs of like giving more independence, what he starts to say is, I need to go visit Sarajevo and give a speech, and it just so happens that's going to be on June 28th, which is a very famous day in Serbian like history as being a time when the Serbians overthrew an occupying force. So it's kind of like if for example, we were on bad relations with the British Empire during this time, and a British envoy decided to visit Washington, D.C. on July 4th, and there's not going to be a lot of positive vibes going towards the Archduke's way. And so it's not really enough for Serbian extremists at this point. Then we get to a guy named Gavrilo Princip. He is a Bosnian Serb. He lives from 1894 to 1918. He's one of 7 assassins. His group, known as the Black Hand, really wants to see a great amount of change come to Serbia very quickly. And so he and his co-conspirators get together and they decide they're going to assassinate the Archduke to try and force the Austro-Hungarians to recognize their claims for independence. He was one of 7 assassins. He really had been training on using a gun to be able to assassinate the Archduke, while a few other ones were known for grenades and bombs, and all of them understood that this was going to probably be a suicide mission, where once they enacted their plan, they were not going to be able to really live through the ordeal. So what happens is on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand arrives in Sarajevo, and his plan is to head to City Hall after getting off the train in an open-top car, and he's going to drive along the riverbank on just a straight path to the City Hall to give a speech. On his way there, these assassins have lined up along the route, knowing full well that he's going to drive by. Well, the first guy, who was one of the assassins, he balked, which means he was going to attack or throw like a grenade or a bomb at the car that was an open-top car, at the Archduke's car. He doesn't do it. He gets too scared and runs away. The second one actually does throw basically an improvised grenade at the open-top car. It misses, bounces off the open-top car, rolls behind the car, behind it, blows up that car, hurting several of the people in the convoy that the Archduke is riding in. Then those assassins attempt suicide, are unsuccessful. Well, eventually the Archduke makes it all the way to City Hall, gives his speech with blood all over his speech. He then decides that him and his wife, who's traveling with him, are going to visit some of the victims of the bombing in the hospital. So he tells his driver, we're going to head to the hospital, right? So he begins down the street, the same street he had just survived those attempted assassins. And while he's driving down the street, his driver decides to make a right turn, not really remembering the route to the hospital, but instead continuing on the route they were going before. Gavrilo Princip is, at this point, thinking that the assassination attempt was successful, starts to walk away, and not really sure what's going on. So he starts to walk down, the street far away. On the route, the driver of Archduke Franz Ferdinand turns right onto a street, and the Archduke tells him to stop. We need to go the other way, and we need to go to the hospital. The driver then starts to shift the car into reverse, but it stalls, and the car dies. And so if you've ever driven a stick shift, it can die sometimes if you don't shift correctly. And it just so happens that from basically about 5 yards away, Gavrilo Princip had been standing on a corner not knowing what to do exactly. And just so happens that the Archduke and his open-top car has stopped right in front of him. Gavrilo Princip pulls out his gun, shoots both Franz Ferdinand and his expectant wife, Sophie, on the way to visit the hospital, and they die. This was also their anniversary, which is just kind of sad. Princip swallows cyanide. It's not effective. Princip was dying at this time of tuberculosis, so he knew he was pretty much on his way out. And so he's captured by the mob, tortured. They take him to trial. They find he's too young to be executed. He's sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he dies of tuberculosis in 1918. Now, if you think about it, there is, in our sad course of human events, many days where people are killed by gunshots. One person shoots another person. What doesn't traditionally happen, or usually happen, is an entire war begins over the bullet of one person shooting another person. This is the first conflict of global proportions. We'd had world-type wars before, if you think back to the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War in the Americas, which were the same war. This was really the first one that involved the entire world, including colonies, and including people who really didn't even know who Gavrilo Princip was, or even Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Conservative estimates of the number of dead are about 15 million, 5 million being non-combatants, and 20 million people were injured as a result of World War I. It'll be the end of 4 empires and the rise of 9 new countries as a result, and it has massive global economic dislocations. Money is going to be lost on a dramatic scale across many cultures, empires, and nations, and it's the end of Europe's complete domination of the globe in the age of imperialism. Well, to kind of understand where the roots of World War I began, we have to look at the 4 main, or MAIN, causes of World War I. And so this is a very handy kind of thing to remember. So when you're working on your AP exam, this is something just to keep in the back of your head. First up is militarism, the M. So militarism was the idea that countries needed large standing armies to be able to fight off people who were trying to take territory from their country. This could be in a number of ways. For example, Germany, Great Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, many of the European nations had been, for a while since industrialization, really building up their military with a couple of reasons. Number one, they believed that having a large military just meant no one could really mess with your stuff. If you're the French in Africa and Germany's kind of starting to take some of your territory in Africa, you can have a large military show up any minute and kind of back them down and make them leave because you have got lots of guys with lots of guns and the newest technology to be able to shoot at them and push them back. Much of the European powers really were focused on having weapons to protect their resources and territories around the world, but also for back at home, they see that because of this conflict around the globe in terms of colonies that they're getting, that maybe there's going to be a war in the near future, and they need to have a large military for that event. You don't want to be the smallest army or the most underprepared army in a giant war. And so this militarism is a part of having the ability to be ready to fight if anyone ever comes to fight with you. Additionally, there is some roots in social Darwinism, which we talked about before, in that the belief was having a large military was a sign of force. And by having that large military with a sign of force, you're able to kind of enact a lot of that pseudo-evolution that we talked about a couple chapters ago, where people thought having a big military resulted in you being able to act out the processes of nature. And so in the same way that the cheetah is fast and able to tackle big antelope in the jungle, you would be able to take your military around the world and really just take whatever you want because by force you're able to dominate. And remember, this has very little to do with actual Darwinism in terms of what Charles Darwin wrote. This was kind of a perverted version of his ideas of the survival of the fittest, which he never really discussed. He talked about the survival of the fittest being the most fit. And this militarism was really an exercise in saying, well, if we have a big army, and we take our big army around the world and we take stuff and nobody stops us, it's like identical to what happens when the cheetah tackles the antelope and eats it. If the antelope didn't want to get eaten, it should have ran faster. In the same way, the European powers were saying, well, if those countries all over the world didn't want us taking their stuff, they should have fought back. So militarism sets up having these large standing armies waiting around for some giant conflict to happen. Then we get to the A, which is alliances. There was a large alliance system between many European powers and their colonies around the globe. These European powers saw it as a valuable tool to stave off war. The belief was that by having this alliance, no one would really fight with one another because they knew they were not fighting a one-on-one war, but they would always bring back up to this fight. My best analogy to this is the idea, if you've ever seen a movie where all the main characters are standing around and they all have guns pointed at each other, and everybody's pointing guns at each other, and as long as nobody fires, everything is fine. And no one's going to shoot first because they know as soon as one person fires their gun, everyone's going to fire their gun and everyone dies as a result of this. The belief was that basically no one was stupid enough to start the war, but we will be ready if anything does happen. The problem becomes that they couldn't have foreseen something as simple as Gavrilo Princip, some random terrorist, killing one basic noble from Austria-Hungary, causing a giant conflict that triggers this alliance system for backup. They couldn't have foreseen that process happening. We also have imperialism. We talked before about how there was this like undercurrent of European powers constantly coming into conflict as they went around the globe. They started to worry about one another, not only in them taking each other's stuff around the world, or their land around the world, but they also figured that uh, the best way to stop the countries that in Europe from taking more stuff was to kind of keep them on their toes back at home. So if you're Germany and you're really worried about France, you don't have to worry so much about far away Africa. You really want to keep France to be afraid to not send all their troops around the world because you want to let them know that if they do go around the world, you might invade them. So they needed to kind of have this balance between the home and protecting their home and their protecting their colonies around the world. And finally, nationalism. Nationalism is starting to grow a lot in many of these countries. Originally, it starts with smaller people groups, but now it's transformed into larger sections of the globe, specifically in the European nations that will fight in World War I. Nationalism is this idea that your country is great and powerful, and as a result, it embodies all the best things of humanity. So if you're French, you think that French culture, French people, French language, French everything is the best. And by being the best, you need to promote your culture, but also protect your culture from outside influence and protect it from destruction by other cultures around the world. You want to preserve what you believe to be the best of humanity, which would be your culture. And so these four things combined together lead people to start to have really the triggering points for World War I. In addition to nationalism, there's also this sense that you want to get your people to be willing to fight and possibly even die for their country, because you have to convince people that if they don't go and fight, that the bad guys on the other side, whoever they may be, pretty much are going to come to your area and hurt your family, hurt your friends, and destroy your culture and everything you believe in and everything that's your way of life. So by having this nationalism, you can convince a lot of people within your country to go and fight on its behalf. Next, we have the larger cause of World War I. It's a culmination of complex nationalism, especially in the South and Eastern Europe. We talked about these competing nationalisms right now. There's a rivalry among empires, especially between Britain and Germany. The grandmother of Europe is known as Victoria, Queen Victoria of England. She, through her bloodline of children and grandchildren, eventually becomes known as the grandmother of Europe. Because she's the grandmother of Europe, she had many nephews and grandsons who pretty much eventually become, by this point, the leaders of many different European nations because of the whole marrying within their own family system that had been established in Europe for many years. So what happens is, early in the mid-1800s, Queen Victoria has a grandson known as Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II will eventually become the Kaiser or leader of Germany during World War I and right before World War I. And he used to visit his grandmother in England every summer. And while he was there, he used to go and spend time with his cousins, who were also going to eventually be leaders of European nations in the future. And while he's there, he develops this love for giant boats, and he likes the British Navy. At this time, we talked about how the British Navy had began to rule the waves around the world, and Royal Britannia, which is their nickname for their navy, he falls in love with their idea of a giant navy. And with Germany having a northern sea access, he wants to eventually build a giant German navy to rival that of Britain. Well, at the same time, Britain being an island wants to make sure that they are able to have a big navy that's able to fend off attacks or invasions, if ever that were the case. And so there's this constant rivalry building up between Britain and Germany. And when you add in nationalism or pride of your country, and you add in this imperialism factor that Britain and Germany are competing for a lot of the same territory around the world, it's going to lead to some negative results. And there were inflexible diplomatic alliances. Basically, that whole gun situation where everyone's pointing their guns at each other. Germany, France, England, and Russia have all signed treaties with one another in different ways, specifically France, England, and Russia, together against Germany. If ever any one of them gets attacked, the others will come to the aid of the one that's attacked. Germany, sitting kind of alone, has decided to ally itself with Italy and Austria-Hungary. And we'll get to that in a little bit. These competing nationalism was the inevitable outcome of French Revolution. Think back to our chapter on the French Revolution. One of the biggest things that people around the world started to take notice of was the Enlightenment was devastating to the old ways and old systems of the world, because the French Revolution was so adamant about liberty, freedom, equality, and the right of the people to have a say in how their government is operating and running. There really is a sense around Europe and starting around the world where the people who are being ruled by faraway empires are saying we don't really need those people to be around for us to be successful. What we need is to basically take care of ourselves. So, for example, if you're Serbian living in Serbia, but a kind of part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you say the Austro-Hungarians have been in charge for a while, but it's not really great for us Serbs. It's not really working out well. So what we need to do is really just do what they did in France with their French Revolution, and maybe we need to kill some people and get this ball rolling where we can have our own system. I highlighted in yellow that there was this idea of self-determination. It starts to kind of pop up that each country should be allowed to determine for itself what kind of government it would like to have. So France wants to have a parliamentary system where they vote on different parliamentary members and eventually have like a prime minister, and that's fine for France. But the former empire that France was a part of, way back in some of the chapters before, they're saying they don't have a say in what France gets to do. Same thing with independent, smaller national groups that are living in, say, the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They are saying we should be allowed to determine for ourselves what kind of government we want, and we probably don't want whoever is the empire in charge of us really being in charge of us anymore. We want to have our own government with our own people. And there's a rise for independence similar to that in the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and many of them are enacting this process by through violence. Belgium, for example, in the 1830s, unification of Italy we studied in a previous chapter in 1861, and the unification of Germany in 1871. So there's these groups that are kind of striking out on the world stage and saying, we're here, we're a distinct group of people, we have a very specific culture and a very specific group that we identify with, and we want to control our area of the globe by ourselves without interference from others. Well, nationalism and multinational empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the south, they have Slavs. In the Russian Empire, there are Poles, Ukrainians. In the Baltic state peoples. In the Ottoman Empire, there are Greeks, Serbians, Romanians, Bulgarians. All these people are looking around and saying we don't need these empires specifically to be in charge of us. We want to have our own country, for example, for the Romanians. Or we Ukrainians want to have our own country for the Ukrainians. And this is going to kind of come to a head as we get forward in our book. Rivalry among empires. The dominance of the British Empire was in decline. In 1870, near the beginning of industrialization, 32% of the world industrial output was British. And so the British were doing pretty well as they began to industrialize. Germany only made up about 13%, but Britain by 1914 had it dropped to only 14% as other nations began to industrialize. Because of this dominance and decline in resources and decline in manufacturing output and decline in basic cash coming into Britain, Britain is starting to look around and say we need to really change this up because we're not getting the same returns on investment we had before. There's imperial competition. Germany's a latecomer, but is very aggressive in going around the world and sweeping up sections of the globe for colonies. And there's small-scale disputes around the globe, especially in the Balkans, between a number of the European powers. Naval competition. There's an arms race between the United Kingdom and Germany to control the seas. It was decisive for control of trade routes, just in case there was a need for war. On the right, they start to build these things called dreadnoughts. Now, these giant boats really were specific in that they were metal-sided and that they had giant, large guns. If you look near the front of that boat right there, there is a very large gun. You can see on the side there's like a little person standing next to it. Those guns were seen as being very valuable because of the immense amount of power that those guns could have within them to fire even large distances into territories. And the world had never seen the efficiency of these boats and the power that came as a result of these guns. And the worry was that you didn't want to be the country without having any kind of dreadnought-style boat to be able to protect your holdings, whether it's in Africa or East Asia or just even at home. The role of public opinion. We're going to move to an age of the media where there's an availability of cheap newspapers. Before, there were a lot of restrictions on newspapers and high taxes, but now we've moved to an area where newspapers are able to print pretty efficiently, pretty cheaply. People are writing more about news around the world. News is traveling faster as a result of telegrams and telegraph lines. People are able to read news within a day of it happening, which was unbelievably fast for the time. However, there's little accountability on what could be said in there. There wasn't really any hard and fast laws on what you could and couldn't say. It puts awkward pressure on politicians. So, for example, let's say you're a politician living in Britain, and the newspapers decide that they just don't like you. Whoever owns the newspaper doesn't really seem to like you. And they start to say that our leader, you, for example, is very weak and is not dealing with what needs to be done and not making our country strong, not making our country great. And as a result, we need to elect a new person. Well, if you read that in the newspaper and other people are reading that, you might worry about your job. So what you might want to do is basically go out and say, no, I completely believe in our country and I want to make our country better. So what I'm going to do is pump up the military and make sure we're all ready to get more territory and keep us on the rise rather than on the decline. And many politicians around the world start to speak like this. And if you're like neighbor, for example, was Germany, and you start to read that you have been saying all this stuff about conquering and territory grabbing and very strong military presence, well, then they're going to start to get very boastful about how they're going to conquer and they're going to be strong and they're going to have a large military presence. And this is going to kind of escalate the pressure for conflict. Sacrifice of diplomatic expediency for political support. Instead of sitting down and having smart people in a room negotiate and hash out problems and really deal with making agreements that are going to make everyone happy, they really just want to be seen as valuable to their people back at home, the voter, and they want to basically forego any negotiations because that could make them look weak. And so they're willing to say, what we need to do is really go out and fight. And because they want to fight, other people want to fight, and that's going to end very badly going forward. Inflexible diplomatic alliances. Here's a picture of the military alliances in 1914 between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. There were agreements of mutual defense. Basically, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy made up the Triple Alliance. They sit in the very center of Europe, surrounded by people who traditionally have either invaded them or been at war with them. And the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy sit back and say, here's what we need to do. We need to be able to protect one another if anything goes wrong. Let's say Russia decides to pop off and invade the German Empire. Well, Austria-Hungary, you got to have our backs, just in case that happens, because if they take over the German Empire, there's no telling that maybe they come to Austria-Hungary next. And Italy, you're looking over with the border of France. What you need to do is kind of be aware that what happens if France decides to invade Italy? Well, once they take over Italy, maybe they're going to go to Austria-Hungary. So the German Empire, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and Italy, we need to stick together and kind of watch each other's backs in case anything bad happens. At the same time, if you're the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, what you see is a very large military force forming, splitting the continent in half. And because you don't want these three groups to really gang up on either one of you, or out of three of you, you don't want them to gang up on any of them, you want to make a mutual alliance as well. And this becomes the Triple Entente. France sees the borders between the German Empire and Italy and says, hey, if ever they decide they want to come and invade, they could attack us, and that would be a very difficult battle. So the United Kingdom or Great Britain, we need you to really come to our aid if ever anything bad like that happens. And we're also going to bring in Russia because we'll keep them in check by having basically two sides that they're surrounded by in case they ever want to do anything crazy like invade one another. Now, this makes sense on paper that people wouldn't be stupid enough to really invade one another because you see this as like a balance fight, but also places the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy in a very negative position. If ever they decide they want to invade, they're going to have to fight on two fronts. And this is what leads to the chain reaction for global war. The Triple Alliance is, again, Germany, Austro-Hungarians are joined by the Italians in 1882, and the Triple Entente is Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. The Great War in Europe and Southwest Asia. You can see some of the possessions. You can see the Central Powers, the neutral nation. Switzerland is pretty much neutral for the rest of our book. Allies are thrust into fighting when the war starts, and you can see these red lines are the furthest advanced by either allies or Central Powers. If you look at the lines from where the original borders are, there's not a lot of movement. That is because the war really ends up being kind of a stalemate or kind of a non-successful victory for many people across the world because many of the lines don't even move. Concerns of the alliance. Originally, there's cultural similarities between Germany and Austria-Hungary. In Austria, they speak German. They have a lot of German history that they share. For a very long time, there wasn't a physical border between Germany and Austria. And so with Austria-Hungary being a part of them, they kind of all just seem to get along really well. Well, this leads to some worries of the Russians and the French and the Great British saying that, hey, maybe we need to keep an eye out on this group that's getting a little too buddy-buddy over there, and maybe they decide to join up and be a really big power full of people with guns. There's a worry over a two-front war if you're Germany and Austria-Hungary, that if Russia and France decide they're going to work together to carve up your countries, you need to be prepared to be able to defend against that. There's worries over the English domination of the sea. If you're Germany, Austria-Hungary, or Italy, you're worried that the British are going to basically dominate the sea and not allow you to do your trading, take care of your colonies, resupply your colonies, and you really don't want Britain to get the upper hand. And there's worries over possibility of French attack and Russian interference over the Austrian Balkan policies. Now, if you look here, here's how that two-front war would look. You see Russia could, in theory, invade the German Empire from the east and also the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the east. And if you look, there's a little bit of arrows pointing out for the Poles, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Czechs, Italians, Slovenians, Croats, Serbs. All those people might decide that if Russia shows up, hey, maybe the Russians are a little better than these Austro-Hungarians, so maybe we side with them. So you're really worried that Russia might invade from the east. At the same time, you see these northern ports of the German Empire very accessible and open to attack from the United Kingdom with their large navy through the North Sea. And if you're France, you possibly could go into the German Empire from that arrow on the west and force like a big push to try and carve up the German Empire. So all these groups are really worried about losing territory not only around the world, but also at home. Here were some of the concerns of the Entente. Russia worried about the strong German-Austro-Hungarian alliance. Really, they saw Russia saw itself at the time as not being fully prepared for the world stage. If you remember back a few chapters, they're basically just starting the process of industrialization. They've built a few factories, but they're nowhere near the industrial output of the other European nations. Much of the Russians were still working up until very recently at this point as peasant farmers in the same feudal system that we had looked at back in the Dark Ages. And now, if you're Russia, you're worried about the newest and latest military technology sweeping through and just taking out large sections of Russia and carving up for Germany and Austria-Hungary, having them add those regions to their empire as part that was once part of Russia. The United Kingdom was concerned with maintaining a balance of power. What they really saw was the whole of Europe in the continent part was really a finely balanced like power play. Everybody had enough armies and navies to really protect themselves, but the Great Britain and the United Kingdom did not want a change to occur because that would really leave them vulnerable because they're kind of the odd man out sitting out in the middle of the ocean on an island. France worried about hostilities with Germany, especially over a small section along the border. And military was pact was signed in summer of 1914, and these lead to reciprocal treaty obligations that we talked about before, where everyone kind of has each other's back in terms of the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente having their respective countries and respective empires' best interests in terms of self-protection. There were mutually threatening war plans. The French had Plan 17. It was a heavy emphasis on rapid offense. The French thought one of the best things they could do was with the new age of military technology and military advancement, they really could move on making faster war than had ever been previously possible. With the introduction of machines through steam-powered boats, like the dreadnoughts, and also through gasoline engines now, they're able to have trucks and motorcycles, and really they could make it to the heart of the German Empire before they even were able to mobilize their army. So the French were very clear on saying that the goal is to get to the middle of Germany as fast as possible. If ever there's a war, we're going to hit them quickly. At the same time, the Germans had what was called the Schlieffen Plan. There was a fear, again, of that encirclement or that two-front war, and the idea was that the Germans saw the Russians as a slow-moving beast. You don't need to really worry about a slow-moving beast until it really starts to get going. And what Russia lacked in technological advancements, it vastly outnumbered in terms of just pure amount of people in the Russian Empire. So the idea for the Schlieffen Plan was that the Germans would quickly, if ever war started, run with all their troops over to France and try and basically do a big knockout punch, and by getting to Paris, making them sign a treaty, and then turning around completely and moving their whole army back to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians before they even were able to really mobilize. It was conditional on the mobilization of enemy forces. Most of these plans had counterplans, and those counterplans had counterplans, and all the military generals, as part of that militarization process, really had sat down and spent years thinking about, well, if Germany invades here, then we, France, will push back here, and if they invade here, we'll invade there, and back and forth and back and forth. And this was so well thought out that it actually led to some problems, because every side had basically sat down and had as many contingencies to the invasion process or the attacking or the defending process as possible. So here's how the chain reaction works. On June 28th, 1914, Gavrilo Princip shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. July 23rd of the same year, the Austrians issue an ultimatum to the Serbs saying basically you need to submit to a number of our demands and you need to give up sovereignty and yada, yada, yada. July 28th, the Austrians do not hear a response from the Serbs, so they declare war. July 29th, the Russians mobilize to defend their ally Serbia during this time. And July 31st, the Germans issue ultimatums to Russia and France to stand down and not to go to war with on behalf of Serbia against the Austrians. They don't listen, so on August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia, and France mobilizes their army. On the 3rd of August, the Germans declare war on France and go through Belgium, which is in the northwestern corner of the German Empire, which wasn't really a part of the conflict until it basically was invaded. And on August 4th, Britain comes to defense of Belgium, who they all had treaties with as a part of the Triple Entente. Well, this eventually becomes a war of attrition. Attrition just means not really successfully having victory, but just wearing the other side down through brutal violence. In the West, they end up with 3 years of stalemate. The whole idea of all those plans that the militaries had been forming really comes to fall apart because everybody had already expected everybody else's moves, and in like a game of chess, when you already know what the other player is going to play, you kind of just go through the motions, but then you get stuck. To this point, nobody had really, in Europe, tested out against one another really a full-scale war using the latest and greatest technology. Some of the problems that result in this is that nobody really had any updated fighting techniques to take into account this new technology. So this led to people in both sides having to just basically dig trenches, which are big big like holes in the ground that are very long. And as a result, they just spent much of their time in those trenches. So on one side, you would have the Germans, for example, in their trench. And the hope was every now and then you'd have your officer who's in charge say, okay, guys, load up your guns. We're going to run from our trench over to the French trench. And when we get over there, we're going to kill them all and we're going to take that land and we're going to keep moving. Well, if you're the French, you're pretty smart and you already have set up a bunch of machine guns and you're in your own trench. And so when you hear the Germans are attacking, you just get on your machine guns and have all your men shoot at the guys running at you. Well, there's nothing really to protect you in terms of bullets, so a lot of people die as a result of that. And they die in the middle of what's called no man's land between the two trenches. Well, a few days later, maybe the French decide, well, yeah, we killed a lot of Germans, so maybe it's our turn to kind of return and go back and try and attack them. And so maybe we have our officer say, okay, guys, we're going to blow the whistle, we're going to go over the top of the trench, and we're going to run as fast as we can to try and get into the German trench and try and kill all of them. Well, the Germans already know that the French are going to attack, and so they have their own machine guns and their own artillery, which are giant guns that can fire exploding bombs far away. And they start firing artillery and using machine guns, and French people die in the middle between the trenches. And so nobody really gets very far in any of these fights or conflicts. Everybody just kind of ends up losing lots of men back and forth. They decide to dig these trenches all the way from the English Channel, which is the sea that separates France and England, all the way to Switzerland, which is a giant mountainous country that really nobody can invade ever. So they're all stuck between France and Germany. Nobody's really able to move. In the east, there was some more movement, but we're going to get to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, which places much in the alliance control. The Russians do pretty well near the beginning, and there was a lot of movement, but the Russians go through what's called the Communist Revolution in their country, and they pretty much decide to leave the war because they don't see it as valuable to their new plan of trying to fix the Russian country. New military technology, there's barbed wire. If you've ever seen barbed wire, it's usually on the top of like fences protecting different things around your community. That barbed wire doesn't seem very menacing, but mainly what it was originally designed to do was to get you stuck. And when you see the barbed wire on top of fences, it's usually just one strand. The barbed wire production during this time was massive, and many militaries were using it in some ways, as channeling or funneling of people. So remember that time when I said we'd be running over the top and running at the next trench? Well, imagine there's not really very much area for us to run because there's like tons and tons and tons of barbed wire everywhere. And so while we're running, maybe we're running pretty fast, but then our clothes get caught on barbed wire and then we get tangled and our leg gets wrapped around in barbed wire. And now we can't move. And now we're stuck out in the middle of nowhere, stuck to a bunch of barbed wire that we can't get out of. And there are machine guns and snipers firing at us from all different directions. That's not going to be good for us. And many of the militaries were actually using the barbed wire to channel or kind of focus the attack into certain sections so they could have machine guns fire into specific sections, forcing the people to try and run through them, which would result in higher death counts. At the same time, machine guns, which we talked about in previous chapters, were able to fire very quickly and very efficiently across large distances without really the need for reloading. It's first used, or excuse me, then we get on to gas. We have poisonous gas, chlorine, and mustard gas made from different chemicals. What they started to do was the Germans used gas to try and force originally out of the trenches some of the people they were fighting. So, for example, if you were German, you would use artillery, you would load it up with a gas shell, and inside of there would be these chemicals. And when those chemicals would get fired out of that shell through artillery, it would fly, going through the air like, and then it would land and blow up. And then because it blew up, it mixes the chemicals, and now there's this gas that's floating through the air. And if you were in the trench and the gas seemed to land in your trench, well, it can burn your eyes. It can by making you blind. It can cause suffocation through attacking your lungs. It can cause burns to your skin. And so your job would be to get away from the gas as fast as possible. The Germans would then wait and see that the gas had landed on those people, and when those people tried to climb out of the trench, they would fire on them. Or even if the people had been smart enough to have gas masks, the Germans would then attack after the gas attack with their own gas masks, leading to panic in the trench that they were attacking, where they could basically just go on over and nobody's really firing at them because they're worried about not dying from gas. Mustard gas, for example, kills 800,000 or gets 800,000 casualties. Now, casualties versus deaths. Casualties are basically you are hurt in a way that takes you out of war. Whether that means you're shot, you have a limb blown off, you are burned by the chemicals and they make you blind. So 800,000 people are affected as a result of this. Eventually, near the end of the war, tanks are invented, giant metal mobile fortresses that are able to have guns mounted on them, and they were designed really to do a couple things. Number one, as they traveled across no man's land, they were able to, with their giant tracks, which are these giant like conveyor belt things that ran on wheels, would run over the barbed wire and either flatten the barbed wire or tear the barbed wire apart, allowing people to cross behind the tank. The tank also was made of metal, so any smaller caliber bullets from, say, rifles would bounce off of the tanks harmlessly, and people could travel behind it using it as cover. Also, tanks were really good because they had guns on them. They could blow up enemy positions, making the enemy move back. And also, tanks were really good because they were able to cross large sections very quickly and efficiently, and even able to travel over trenches, so you could have tanks actually get behind enemies while your advancing individual troops move forward. Initially, they were effective, but ground quickly lost to counterattacks as more people introduced tanks and people start to attack back. Airplanes, they weren't the airplanes you would think where they were dropping lots and lots of bombs out of them. You need to think back to your old videos from elementary school when you learned about the Wright brothers inventing the airplane. That's pretty much what we're working with, but a little more sophisticated. They couldn't carry many really any bombs in the way that we would think of a bomb today falling out of a plane, but a few of them did have machine guns attached to the front of them. A few of them are used as spotting planes. Some of them would take grenades and release a whole bunch of them over an enemy position and basically try and kill as many enemies. Sometimes there was fights in the air between different armies' planes. And it was limited bombing, limited strafing, and used primarily for reconnaissance, looking around and seeing where troops were. Then we have dirigibles, which are giant inflatable balloons. Some of them were used for marking positions, some were used for reconnaissance, some were used for transportation. And finally, we have submarines. Submarines had been around before this, but not really to this extent, where they had self-contained crews that were able to live on them and work on them, and they could live under the water for a number of days or a number of hours, and depending on which ones you were talking about, and they could sink boats in the ocean without exposing themselves to attack. Submarines for the Germans were called U-boats or underwater boats. The brutality of new warfare. Here's some examples of what happened. I got a little in-color version of World War I battlefield after the battle. You can see pretty much it's just a giant patch of dirt that has been blown up a number of times. This was unprecedented. The reason World War I was so destructive was that it was the combination of really good technology that had been advanced through the process of industrialization, but it was also a misunderstanding of tactics. We saw before with some of the African tribes that had tried to attack Europeans that they were unsuccessful at launching just giant frontal assaults on the front of their machine guns because they thought originally that they would need to reload, but with these new machine guns not needing to reload, this resulted in a number of casualties. For example, in Verdun in 1916, 315 French were killed, 280 German casualties, and less than 160,000 bodies were recovered as a result of this one battle. The Somme, the British gained a few thousand yards, and there's 420,000 casualties. And by the end of it, there was no significant strategic advantage. There hadn't been a lot of movement in terms of where the troops were on the map. There hadn't been really a decisive victory as a result of this, and it results in a couple battles happening at this area in the Somme. The Great War in Europe and Southwest Asia again. Here's the same map we looked at before, and I kind of want to re-highlight this section that if you look at those little red lines, the borders for individual countries and the borders that, or the lines where people were fighting don't really move that far into any given territory. So there's not a lot of change as a result of these battles and this massive amount of human death and suffering. Now we're going to look a little bit more of like the cultural aspects of the war. We're going to talk about total war on the home front. As a result of this modern industrial war, there's now a concept of what's called a home front. No longer is it just the boys are fighting far away in the trenches for us. Really, we at home need to do a number of things to support them. The governments of these countries are unable to really produce goods at the scale that they believe they could, so they had to kind of change strategies in how they were going to support their troops and support their country as a whole. The government then takes command of economies. So in a normal capitalist system that we had talked about before, individuals and business owners and different people just kind of make decisions however they want. If you want tomorrow to spend some money and you have the money to go buy a bunch of food, you can go buy a bunch of food, or you can go buy a bunch of clothes if you want, and you just go out and you buy it, and as long as it's at the store and they're willing to sell it, you can buy it. Well, under total war, it's a concept where the government basically says we don't have the resources to be able to supply everyone everything they need whenever they want it. What we need to do is really focus on winning the war. And so when we're focusing on winning the war, we need to make sure that the people are not wasting goods and materials. So for example, in a total war economy, the government might ration food. So what they might do is send to every home and every family and say, okay, here's your coupon book. And it's not really a coupon for discounts, it's a coupon book of what you're allowed to buy. Inside of there would be coupons for the month, and you'd have 4 tickets, and they'd have a date on it. And each of those tickets would say bread, 1 loaf of bread. So you'd go down to the store, and all the stores were basically forced by law and under penalty of basically treason and getting in trouble from the government that they were only allowed to sell you 1 loaf of bread, and it would have the date on it, and you would turn that in when you bought your loaf of bread. And if you ran out of bread during that week, you couldn't get more bread until the next week when your next coupon was ready to be used at the store. This was designed so that individuals did not take up too many resources or get too much supplies that weren't really available, and they could send a lot of the extra supplies to the soldiers on the front line, preparing them for battle. Also, this went from everything from food to metal resources. There were, in some ways, there were like collecting resource, almost like a crude form of recycling where people would collect like metal and turn it into government, and they would repurpose it for, like melt it down and repurpose it for guns and ammunition. Some things like nylon sometimes were, like women's stockings were rationed because nylon was used for different military applications. In World War II, for example, they were used for like parachutes. At the same time, the government is kind of controlling what's happening in individuals' lives. Electricity is rationed. Lots of things are rationed as a result of this. Women in the workforce, as many of the men go off to fight in the war, the youngest and the most strong basically men of their time would have been out in the trenches, but there's still some need to produce goods back at home. So women, for the first time in history, enter the workforce in large numbers and actually take on roles that traditionally were only held by men in factories. For example, women worked in TNT factories. The TNT is a explosive material that goes inside of bombs and artillery shells, and that when it lands, it blows up and hopefully will kill the enemy. But the problem with TNT is if you're not very careful, it can poison you because it's a very noxious kind of combination of chemicals. And for example, there are women who were working in the workforce in those factories filling up artillery shells that eventually got yellow skin. And by yellow, I mean like the Simpsons. They kind of turned into this very bright neon kind of yellow, and they developed orange hair like carrots because of the poisoning. And many of them died earlier as a result of this poisoning. And there's a shift to total war being about not just fighting off in faraway battlegrounds, but really trying to get people at home to want to not fight this war. So there was bombing of civilian areas by Zeppelins. On the right-hand side here, you see this big balloon thing. They were able to attach larger bombs that weren't able to be attached to planes, and they could fly these Zeppelins farther, and eventually they would fly over areas where there weren't any soldiers, but there were just people living their day-to-day lives, and they would release bombs. And the goal was that by blowing up people's stuff back at home, it would make the soldiers very sad and not want to fight as much. It would make the politicians rethink their strategies. It would make the generals change, have to protect those civilians, and it would make the civilians maybe tell their leaders that they don't want to be in the war anymore. So this becomes a new type of fighting where it's more mental or psychological rather than just physical out in a battlefield between two opposing armies. Then we get to war propaganda. It's the maintenance of public support for war. The idea behind it was you kind of try and convince your country and your culture to approve the war through posters or images or campaigns and sayings so that people will be very supportive of the rationing process. They'll be supportive of the boys over in the trenches fighting, and that the whole of the government is kind of aimed in one direction, trying to support the war and being successful in the war. Through this process, many times it was there were untruths that were told as a result of this to try and get people to have like a one-dimensional understanding of the violence, or to try and get people to see it as not a very complex conflict, but basically the goal was to try and make people see it as we are the good people, whoever we are, versus they, the other side, is bad people, and we need to stop them from coming and hurting us. And if we let them win, then everything's going to be bad and everything's going to be negative. So we need to make sure we fight really hard and support our guys over in the trenches. And by doing that, we are protecting our way of life, we're protecting our families, we're protecting our culture. The irony becomes later that because propaganda was so strong in World War I, by the time World War II shows up, when we get to the end of World War II and people start to realize some of the biggest atrocities or violence that happens during World War II, many people don't really want to believe it because they think it's just more propaganda and more lies. Now here's a poster of a U.S. Army enlistment poster. And the idea behind it is to try and convince you that the enemy is like a savage beast. For example, it says destroy the mad brute. And a brute is someone who's uncultured and just violent and hurts people for no reason. It pictures the traditional German helmet, and on it says militarism. And that German helmet is the German army coming to fight. And on their right hand, they have like a bat and a giant stick with blood all over it, showing that they had already attacked. Underneath the guerrillas' feet, there is the words America, which signifies that it would be our soil. And in the right hand of or the left hand of the gorilla, there is a woman being carried off, probably to be violated and abused. And so by showing you this picture, the idea was that the U.S. Army was saying, you good men of America, you need to come out and you need to enlist, because if we don't go over to Germany and fight these bad, savage Germans, they're going to take their militarism and their bad culture, and they're going to come over here to America and hurt our women and hurt our families and hurt people that we love. So you need to come and fight with us so we can stop this from happening. It's pretty effective when you don't really know what people are doing with this kind of poster, because you automatically get this kind of deep internal feeling of needing to protect those you love. Now there's global involvement, importation of troops from the colonies. As a result of the imperialism that we studied in chapters previously, people are starting to say that, well, you Australians, for example, you New Zealanders, you people from Canada, you're part of the British Empire too. And if you don't help us fight, there isn't going to be a British Empire. So you need to come on over here, and everything that you love about being Canadian or being New Zealander or Australian is going to go away if we lose over here in Europe. So you need to send troops over to help fight. What really ends up happening is this comes to a head specifically for the United Kingdom and Anzac forces, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Great Britain, fighting in an area known as Gallipoli. I put a little red square around Istanbul. The idea for it was, if you remember back, Great Britain is allies with Russia. Now, it's really hard to get supplies to Russia, especially near the southern areas where they were fighting against the Austro-Hungarians and Germans. And so the best way for the British to resupply the Russians was to go through the Dardanelles Straits, through the Aegean Sea, and right past right past Istanbul, not Constantinople. If you remember back, however, the people of Istanbul had built in their port a giant chain system that really stopped all trade to be able to go into the Black Sea if they didn't want it to happen. So if we zoom in a little bit, here is the Aegean Sea, and the blue boats represent the Allied forces and their transport of the British troops, the Anzac troops in yellow eventually, and the French troops. And then we have the Ottoman Empire, who is on the side at this point of the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, keeping the Allied forces, which they changed their name to, I know it gets a little confusing, during the war. So I'll kind of click here and it'll show it moving. You can see that Anzac troops land and push back, but then there's a reinforcement. You see French troops. You see there's lots of fighting. You see more reinforcements. And really, Gallipoli was a very kind of like a stalemate, but lots and lots of Anzac forces die as a result of this. There was a second group trying to push through or push back. They eventually retreat and are unsuccessful. Well, at the same time this is all happening, there's a growing amount of discontent happening in Russia. The Russian Tsar is seen as being careless and out of touch with the people. He has led the Russian people into a war that has cost lots and lots of Russian lives. And there are a number of people within Russia that are saying we need this to change. Well, one day in March, Russia has what's known as the March Revolution. And in 1917, they have Lenin, who is pictured here on the left, brought in from Switzerland, where he was living in exile after being in trouble in Russia for a while, gets smuggled back into Germany to try and upset what was happening in Russia, to try and hopefully get them to not really be a part of the war anymore. The Germans were pretty smart at this point. They were losing the war, and they had to have like a big kind of event to try and change the tide. And so their goal was to say, okay, we know this Lenin guy got kicked out of Russia for being too crazy and too radical. Let's go get him from Switzerland. Let's put him on a train and let's ship him back to Russia. And when he gets there, we know he'll go crazy and all. He's a big communist and he's going to make all those people want to fight each other. And maybe if they have their own like civil war, they won't want to fight in the world war anymore, or maybe Lenin will get in charge and maybe he'll just not want to fight because he's not really into World War I anyways, and that'll be good for us because as us Germans and Austro-Hungarians are working together, we really need Russia to stop being on that one side so we can really focus on France and Great Britain. So Germany sends in Lenin. In November Revolution is the creation of the USSR led by Lenin, where his Communist Party takes over and makes it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Just a number of countries that Russia kind of is organized under. At this point, it's pretty much just a big section of Russia. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it gives up Poland, which is an area in Russia, and it creates Poland and the Baltic countries, and it gives Ukraine to the Central Powers. Well, you might be wondering where the U.S. is in this. I mean, if you remember back a few chapters, the U.S. really didn't want to play over in Europe because every friggin' year there basically is a number of problems happening in Europe. And most of the Americans see it as a faraway problem that doesn't really affect America. But America is starting to realize that things that are happening around the world they can no longer ignore. If you remember back to the Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, we have, as Americans, a problem. We need to pick a side. And we kind of fall on the side of the British and the French. The U.S. and the war economy. There's a sale of goods to allies. So originally we're willing to sell goods to the British because we're willing to make money. They get in debt to American banks, and U.S. neutrality or not picking a side is really just fake. At this point, we pretty much are involved in the war with not really saying it in a number of ways. The Germans decide to blockade British overseas trade, which includes American shipments of anything to the British island. And there are submarine patrols or U-boat patrols all over the North Atlantic, protecting, or not protecting, really forcing any boats trying to bring supplies to Britain from not being able to land, similar to what Napoleon was trying to do with his continental system. But then one day in May 7, 1915, there was a passenger ship, kind of like a cruise ship, on its way from America to England, and they were sunk by a German U-boat. At the time, it was one of the largest naval catastrophes. 1,198 lives were lost. 120 of them were U.S. Citizens. And later we come to find out that even though this was a very tragic kind of like negative thing on the world stage, we Americans were secretly shipping munitions, which are like guns, ammunition, bombs, to the British to help them with their war effort. So even though the Germans probably shouldn't have sank that boat, it was really seen later on as being something that they had to do because it was bringing more supplies to the British to kill more Germans. The U.S. eventually will declare war in April 1917, and you might wonder why there's a gap. It's because the U.S. really doesn't see the sinking of Lusitania as a catalyst for war. It's one big problem that we have as the United States with Germany, but really it comes about later with the introduction of the Zimmermann telegram. A German diplomat sends a telegram to the diplomats in Mexico and says, hey, Mexico, we know you guys in the past have lost some land to the United States, like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. What you need to do is help us out. We want you to come and help us fight World War I. If you're willing to come and help us fight World War I, when we're all done with that, we will help you reinvade America and get back some of that land that was taken from you. Well, this angers many Americans, leading to eventual the U.S. joining the war. Well, finally, we're at the end of the war. It's the fall of 1918. The Central Powers are basically exhausted. They've fallen back to a defensive position, and they're basically falling apart under the weight of the war. Bulgaria, the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Germans all surrender. They signed an armistice or a peace treaty on the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month, 1918. Now, they intentionally chose this specific saying that I just said, the 11th day, 11th hour, 11th month, 1918, because there was a belief amongst many that because this war was so violent and so catastrophic, and we had seen the outcome of industrialization, and we'd seen what people were able to do with the newest technologies and violence and war, that no one would ever start another war after this because it was so devastating. That wasn't actually true. We then get to a Paris Peace Conference where we're going to have a few people, specifically what's known as the Big Four: France, Great Britain, the United States, and Italy, who would switch sides in the middle of the war, sit down and say, okay, we are going to decide how the world is going to be carved up going forward. The United States came late, but we have our president right there on the far right, Woodrow Wilson. He has a plan, and he has this thing called the 14 points. Woodrow Wilson has written down these 14 points and believes if the whole world adopts this and everyone agrees that these 14 bullet points will basically bring about peace to the entire world. At this peace conference, no Central Powers were allowed to represent themselves or have any say in the negotiations. It was a dictated peace, which means basically these four countries with their representatives and a few others decided what was going to happen to the losers of World War I. The peace treaties are harsh on the Central Powers and basically place lots of restrictions on one specific group, Germany. If you remember back to the very beginning, the reason World War I started, according to our narrative, is that Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian named Gavrilo Princip. Yet, at this peace conference, all powers agree that Germany was the sole responsible country to take the blame for World War I. There's some debate on whether or not that makes lots of sense, but to many Germans, here's how they saw it. They saw that some guy shot some other guy in a faraway country, and Germany was blamed for killing millions of people. Germany's very upset about this, saying that war guilt is not our fault. Germany is also dictated to that they have to have a smaller army. They're no longer allowed to have certain sections of their empire. It's actually going to be given parts of it to France, and part of it is going to be given over to other powers in Europe. They're no longer allowed to have a navy, really. They have, I think, 10 ships they're allowed to have, and if you're a militaristic power at this time, 10 ships is nothing compared to what other countries have. Germany also is forced to, as a result of taking on the entire guilt of the war, pay back what is in today's amount of money, billions and billions of dollars in debt to the countries that won the war to try and rebuild their economies. And every colony overseas is handed over every colony overseas that Germany had is handed over to the victor countries. Now, if you're German, here's what you see. Your sons, your nephews, your young men of your country have been in trenches, and they fought, and they died. No one of any country invaded the land that was core Germany on the map. If you go back to those maps, you'll see Germany never really got invaded. At the same time, the entire world is placing all the blame on Germany, even though they're not really the ones who started anything in the first place. Germany now has to pay tons and tons of money, which they don't have because they lost the war, to a bunch of countries who won the war. And as a result of paying all this money, they don't even have colonies to continue their industrialization to continue to make money. So if you're German, you're very upset, you're about to become very poor, and you're going to be looking around for anything that's going to help you pull out of this problem. And that's where we'll get to when we get to World War II. Territorial changes in Europe after the Great War. If you look in green, territorial Austro-Hungarian Empire, basically Austria and Hungary are split up. Countries are made out of different people groups that we talked about before, like, for example, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Germany loses large sections of its land. Poland is created as a result. We have the Alsace-Lorraine down in France area. We have Luxembourg kind of carved out. And then we have Belgium and the Netherlands, and demilitarized zones in purple. You can see a few different changes on this map. Now we're going to kind of pause in the narrative of World War I. That's over. We're going to go look at the Ottoman Empire. This is the end of the Ottoman Empire. At the end, the Ottoman Empire had sided with Austria-Hungary and what was then known by that point as the Central Powers. And they decided to sign the Treaty of Sèvres, which removes the Balkan and Arab providence and allows for European occupation in the south and East Anatolia. And then they get this guy named Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, who leads an uprising against the Sultanate of the Ottoman Empire and creates the Republic of Turkey. The Allies then recognize the Republic of Turkey as being a more Western-style democracy, and it's a largely secular government. It includes some women's rights, and Ataturk is seen as the father of Turkey. Territorial changes in Southwest Asia after the Great War. You see some British protectorates in orange. Basically, the British decide we are going to make those orange sections colonies, and by colonies, we mean that they're going to be able to be in charge of their own stuff, but we get to do whatever we want there and kind of dictate terms on what's going on. The Ottoman Empire in green, and then these League of Nations mandates are those like striped regions. And what that means, the League of Nations, which we're going to talk about in a second, really is going to be in charge of those regions. Then we get to Woodrow Wilson's big idea, which is the League of Nations. It was created by diplomats in Paris, and there were 42 original member states, and 26 were non-Europeans. The European powers and America and a few other countries around the world decided to sit down at the peace conference and say, what we need to do is instead of having a giant system where people are going to fight and kill each other and have giant wars whenever they disagree, we need a body where people can bring complaints and we can hash it out and debate it and have diplomacy and try and avoid war. There's an application of Wilson's concept of self-determination, that each country should be allowed to pick for itself what kind of government it has, who should be in charge of each region, and so if you're a people group living under an empire, you should be allowed to get rid of that group. And Wilson sees this as a huge victory for world peace. It becomes a forerunner to the United Nations. The problem with the League of Nations is a couple. Number one, they don't really hammer out how it's going to settle any disputes. For example, the League of Nations did not have a standing army. With the modern UN, there's at least some guys with guns that are called peacekeepers. If ever there's something bad going on around the globe, the peacekeepers will go out and with their guns protect those that are under need of protection from the UN. League of Nations, however, did not have any guys with guns to be able to stop anybody from fighting one another or invading one another. Additionally, the League of Nations, at the beginning, really was a great idea, but the United States, with its President Woodrow Wilson, doesn't eventually join the League of Nations because people in the United States see the League of Nations as giving up too much independence from the United States over to an unelected body in the according to many Americans, and they say that we don't want a bunch of random people from far away telling us how we can live our lives. So the U.S., with their president, Woodrow Wilson, who basically came up with the idea, doesn't even join, weakening the power that the League of Nations has. And eventually, it really is mismanaged and really unable to be prepared for what's about to happen as we move into later conflicts and especially into World War II. There's a mandate system that's created to control formerly colonized areas. There's this belief that we need to kind of have an overseeing group that shares the resources of those areas in those colonies, but many in those colonies that are now under the mandate system see imperialism again, but just now with a bunch of Europeans rather than just one specific European country. So it's not going to work very well. Wow, and we made it. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Explain and discuss the key causes behind the drift toward European war in the early 20th century. Identify and discuss key alliance systems and their members. Discuss the global expansion of the Great War. Discuss the experience of trench warfare and its impact on soldiers and civilians. Understand the features of total war and its social and economic consequences. Compare and contrast the course of the war in Africa, Southwest Asia, and East Asia. Explain the links between the Great War and the Russian revolutions of 1917. Identify and explain the reasons behind the U.S. intervention in the Great War and the collapse of the Central Powers. And finally, outline and discuss the important legacies of the end of the war and European preeminence. Here's your writing assignment. Write a short response, 5 cents, blah, blah, blah. Number 1. Was World War I a preventable war? Or were the nations of Europe committed to fighting even before the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand? Can you envision a realistic scenario by which the outbreak of war might have been averted? Number 2, what were the essential elements of Woodrow Wilson's peace program? You're going to have to look that up. Which of his 14 points were included in the final peace treaties? Why was it so difficult to implement his vision? As a result of us finishing this up, it's time for you to go back and reread. I hope this has been helpful. We've only scratched the surface, obviously, of World War I. Be sure to really focus in on your book. It's super complex, and you could spend hours and hours and days studying this and still not really have a firm grasp on it. But I tried to give you just a quick overview of World War I. But make sure you head back to your book and get what you can out of it. I'll talk to you guys a little bit later. Bye.
What we do here is go back.